A popular trait with anamorphic lenses beyond lens flare is oval bokeh. So on a smartphone, what kind of bokeh can you actually get? If you've seen our Moment versus Moondog Labs anamorphic shootout, you saw where we touched a little bit on bokeh, but we didn't really get too far into it. Shallow depth of field is not something inherent or normally associated with smartphones. So in other words, it's kind of hard to get. And for those who don't know exactly what bokeh is, bokeh has been defined as the way the lens renders out of focus points of light. So basically, it's the aesthetic quality of the blur produced in the out of focus parts of an image. Traditional spherical lenses produce circles in the bright highlights, but you can put filters on a lens to produce all sorts of interesting bokeh. And bokeh is not just limited to the highlights or the pinpoints of light. The blur occurs in all out of focus regions of the image. So what about with a smartphone and a Moment anamorphic lens? We set up a shoot with our friend Spider-Man to test this out. The best way that I know of to get shallow depth of field with a small phone sensor is to put the subject close to the phone. So Spider-Man is just about 10 inches away here. The lights I put behind him were pumpkins. It's Halloween season. And I'm using the standard iPhone lens as a baseline. So first up, the stock iPhone wide lens. Shooting FiLMiC Pro 24 frames per second, natural color profile. This lens is an f1.8, the shutter is 1/24th and the ISO is 34. Right behind me is a big window, and so this is being lit by daylight only. And we've got some shallow depth of field there. I shot this in 4K, but I'm editing in HD so I can push in 100% on the image to see it more closely and to really check out the bokeh. And looking at the lights, the bokeh is a sphere, it's circular. So now I'm going to add the Moment anamorphic lens to the iPhone wide lens. Same settings as before, just with the anamorphic. Although the light changed just a little bit and it's a little bit darker behind him, exposure on Spider-Man stayed the same. Now looking at this bokeh a little bit closer, it's not a circle, it's not spherical, but it's not exactly oval either. A couple of them are more oval, but several of them just look like little blobs of light. And one more look here on the iPhone wide lens, adding an ND filter. Neutral density not only help control your shutter, but they can also help create shallow depth of field. So the settings were the same, but the ND 0.9 filter takes away 3 stops of light. So that required cranking the ISO up to 196. Using FiLMiC Pro, I do not like going over ISO 100 if I don't have to, because the footage gets noisy quickly. And in this case, looking at the depth of field and the bokeh, I don't see any difference. It just seems like the footage is noisier to me. So in this particular example, I'm not going to use the ND on any more of the test footage. This would definitely make a difference outside, but in this condition where the light level is already a little bit low, I'm putting the ND filter back in the bag and we'll use it next time we're shooting outside. The shallow depth of field looks about the same. Adding the Moment lens, which is wider, appears to have a little more depth of field, not quite as shallow. This is not a sharpness test, and shooting 4K focus is very critical, especially when you're analyzing it up close like this. So the stock iPhone lens is a little sharper. This most likely has to do with adding the lens to the phone and then the minimum focus distance. So now I'm going to shoot the same thing but with the iPhone Tele lens. This lens is an f2.8, so there is a difference in the aperture, and in lower light can cause more noise. But it can also help create more shallow depth of field. So the settings are the same except for the ISO. That did change with this new setup. ISO 61, 1/24 shutter, but again shooting with the f2.8 Tele lens. And the depth of field is definitely more shallow. And the bokeh is spherical, it's rounded and more blurred. I think some people might be surprised at just how much shallow depth of field you can get with a smartphone. And now here I'm adding the Moment anamorphic to the Tele lens on the iPhone. As a side note, this is one way to decrease or eliminate the distortion. You're shooting past it more or less using the Tele lens. And you've got similar shallow depth of field as the native iPhone Tele lens, but the bokeh is oval. It's kind of a horizontal oval versus a vertical bokeh that I'm used to seeing in more traditional anamorphic lenses. Using a 1.33 times lens though like this, you're not going to get a lot of stretch like you would using a 2 times from a 4x3 sensor. This is doing an anamorphic squeeze using a 16x9 sensor. So comparing the two Tele lens shots here, the shallow depth of field looks virtually identical. And here I did a split screen look, the iPhone Tele on the left and the Moment Anamorphic on the iPhone Tele on the right. The iPhone lens has circular bokeh, the Moment is more oval, and the pinpoint light is a little bit brighter. The other thing you'll notice is the iPhone Tele lens is much sharper on Spider-Man. Let me reiterate and emphasize that this was not approached as a sharpness test. We do not want to imply that these Moment lenses aren't sharp. So far we've seen nothing that would indicate that, except for the buzz focused here, which can definitely happen when you're shooting with such shallow focus, especially in 4K. And adding a third-party lens here does seem to change the minimum focus distance.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special report.
So after we recorded the voiceover for this video and analyzing the footage, I decided to go back and look at the focus and sharpness again, just to make sure we're not missing something. This footage was shot after the fact, and I also did a screen recording here showing FiLMiC Pro and focus peaking. So I set the Spider-Man action figure exactly 11 inches from the camera, and this time I paid very close attention to the focus. Not that I didn't before, but this time I'm looking at this from a lens sharpness perspective versus bokeh. So the iPhone wide lens looks very sharp, it looks good, and now here I'm putting on the Moment Anamorphic lens. So I didn't change anything, I just added the lens, left the focus and the exposure exactly the way it was. And when you see the FiLMiC Pro screen recording here, the peaking is all green, that means it's in focus. But in reality, he's not completely sharp. So I unlocked the focus there and you could see it change. Now I'll drag it over and reset the focus for this new lens. It's a subtle change, but again, focus is very critical in 4K like this. And now Spider-Man appears to be sharp. And by the way, I did this on the earlier shots as well that ended up being slightly buzzed. So it's just something you really need to pay attention to in shallow focus situations. Now both these shots appear to be sharp and the depth of field looks very similar as well. With the side-by-side comparison, the iPhone stock lens is ever so slightly sharper and pushing in 100% on the 4K image. If you're watching this on a desktop computer or a TV, you should be able to see that the Moment lens is slightly softer. On a mobile device, you likely can't tell the difference. So what does this mean? Well, first off, I would say that the peaking in FiLMiC Pro is not 100% accurate. It's a great thing to use, but you always want to double check it. Secondly, and this is almost common sense, but adding a piece of glass on top of another lens is likely going to soften it. It's not like you're adding a lens to a sensor on a DSLR or a mirrorless camera. You're actually adding the lens over another piece of glass.
We now return you to your regularly scheduled program.
Okay, one more quick test here, and this was shot purposely out of focus so we could compare the actual bokeh. This is the iPhone wide lens. Bokeh looks round. And then here's the anamorphic, exact same shot. Bokeh definitely has an oval look to it. Again, more of a horizontal stretch versus a vertical stretch though, which to me was an interesting result. iPhone wide lens. The lights are just several inches from the camera. And now the anamorphic. And here I think you can really see the oval bokeh on that bottom light versus just the iPhone wide lens. And for those wondering how this compares to a more traditional camera, I decided just for kicks to shoot the same thing with my LX100, which is a micro 4/3 sensor. This has the same sensor as the Panasonic GH4. And as I'm sure you imagined, it is significantly more shallow and the bokeh is very pronounced and circular, a spherical look. The Panasonic LX100 is the most shallow. It also has the most pronounced and out of focus bokeh, and the iPhone wide lens also having round bokeh and being fairly shallow, a little bit more shallow than the Moment Anamorphic and its subtly oval bokeh. One last thing. A few commenters on the anamorphic videos we've been putting up recently have talked about using a filter like this one from VidAtlantic. This is called the Cinemorph, and it uses a filament with an oval shaped filter to more or less fake an anamorphic look on a 16:9 image. This might be a good option for those of you that don't have an anamorphic or don't like all the characteristics except for maybe the lens flares or the bokeh. I will be shooting with this very soon, so if you're not subscribed to our channel, be sure to do that so you won't miss this upcoming video. So overall, I would say if you're wanting to achieve shallow depth of field with your iPhone or with a Moment anamorphic, you can definitely do it. Is that a reason to buy an anamorphic lens for a smartphone? No, I would say that's not one of the reasons to do it. Shooting anamorphic is a lot of fun, but the main reason to get one for your smartphone anyway are the lens flares and the true widescreen 2:3:9:1 aspect ratio. Hope you found this video useful. If you liked it, please give us a thumbs up. Thank you very much for watching, and we will see you guys in the next one. Really?